Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I'm Debbie Liu. I'm the Associate Director of eSig. I wanted to welcome everyone to this special webinar. For those of you who aren't familiar with eSig, we are a membership-based nonprofit organization. We provide our members with objective information, resources, and networking opportunities in support of renewable energy and energy systems integration decisions. And we do this through workshops, tutorials, webinars, blogs, working group and task force activities, and producing technical resource materials. eSig also leads one of the pillars of the Global Power System Transformation Consortium, or GPST, whose mission is to bring together key actors to catalyze a rapid, clean energy transition at unprecedented scope and speed. More information on GPST can be found at www.globalpst.org. At eSig, we recently completed our markets and meteorology workshop this summer, as well as a new workshop on long-term load forecasting that we were very fortunate to have Jesse Jenkins deliver a fantastic keynote for. And you can view all of that on our YouTube channel. And presentations are available on our website at www.esig.energy. We're now preparing for our fall technical workshop, which will start October 23rd. It's in person, it's in San Diego, and at that workshop, FERC Commissioner Allison Clements will deliver the keynote. Our workshops, our monthly webinars, our blogs are open to everyone. Please feel free to register anytime on the eSig website. And also you can see us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. So just a few logistics before we get started. We're going to mute everyone's lines for the duration of the webinar to avoid any distraction. And for questions and answers, we have moved to the Slido platform. So please go to slido.com and enter in ESIG12, ESIG12, as the event code. And you can enter in your questions there. You can also do a thumbs up next to questions that you also are interested in. And that will help to prioritize the questions that we provide answers to. We plan to save 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. We'll wrap it up at the top of the hour. We'll send you all an email with a link to the video. And we also plan to provide short responses to unanswered questions after the webinar. Please don't be afraid to ask questions through Slido. So today's topic, it's going to be on voluntary procurements of carbon-free electricity. As you know, corporations around the world like Google, Amazon, Walmart, they voluntarily pledge to use clean electricity. And there's various ways to carry out these goals. But what's the resulting impact on emissions? And what types of systems get built out as a result of how they implement these goals? So today, we're very fortunate to have two speakers from Princeton University who have modeled different approaches to implementing these clean energy goals, and they're going to discuss their findings today. The first is Professor Jesse Jenkins from Princeton's Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering and Anlinger Center for Energy and Environment. Jesse leads the Princeton Zero Lab, as well as the REPEAT project, which is just an incredible public service because he can quickly model impacts of federal policy proposals. The second speaker is Wilson Ricks, a PhD candidate in the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, and he's a member of the Zero Lab. And he has a master's from Princeton University and a bachelor's degree from the University of Chicago. Short reminder again, use slido.com with the event code of ESIG12 to ask your questions. Okay, let's go ahead. I'm going to turn it over to Jesse to start.
Thanks very much, Debbie. I appreciate the opportunity to join all of you today and to talk about some of our recent research on this topic. Let's share a screen here. All right. So we have seen, as many folks here know, quite rapid growth of wind and solar deployment in the United States and indeed around much of the world over the last decade or so, now providing a substantial share of U.S. generation and growing at a rapid pace. This is critical, of course, to our overall decarbonization goals. And so it's important to think about what drives this clean electricity growth. And to date, what we've seen as the key drivers here are a virtuous cycle or feedback loop between government policy that has helped support wind and solar resources with various subsidies and procurements when they were more expensive than would be picked up by the market on its own. In partnership with voluntary actions by corporate and individual purchasers that have been willing to express a higher willingness to pay for these cleaner resources, driving favorable market economics that lead to greater deployment, lower costs, and potential for greater government policy ambition and action and corporate procurement, and so on and so forth. And we've seen, in fact, that while government policy plays a central role in driving the deployment of wind and solar, that voluntary clean energy procurements by corporations, institutions, and individuals has also played a central role in accelerating the deployment of these technologies and accelerating decarbonization. In fact, about a third of all U.S. wind and solar capacity additions to date have been supported by voluntary corporate and institutional purchases. That's about 71 gigawatts deployed since 2014 and about 17 gigawatts alone in 2022. So this is a substantial contributor to the overall uptake of wind and solar resources, in particular in the U.S. market and indeed in markets around the world. And these purchases not only express in many cases a higher willingness to pay, but also typically come in the form of long-term contracts like power purchase agreements that are often integral to project financeability and bankability for individual wind or solar projects. It's very difficult to find any projects that are purely merchant, selling their power purely on the short-run market. And these sorts of structured purchase agreements are critical to de-risk the investment in these projects and help them secure lower cost capital to be able to move forward and invest. It's also important to note that many of these corporate procurements are motivated in part by the role of voluntary purchases in corporate emissions accounting. Scope 2 emissions, or those that are outside of the immediate boundary of direct emissions from corporate operations, include those from electricity consumption. And for most major companies and institutions, the largest source of Scope 2 emissions, and probably in many cases the largest source of emissions overall in the inventory for a company, comes from their electricity consumption. So as concerns about sustainability grow in the corporate community, efforts to contain or reduce Scope 2 emissions have centered on the purchase of cleaner electricity sources. So what does it mean then when a company claims to use clean electricity? To date, what we've typically seen in the GHG Scope 2 protocol is that companies use what are so-called energy attribute certificates or renewable energy certificates or credits that are transferred from the producers of clean electricity to the corporate actor who retires them from various registries to represent the consumption of clean megawatt hours. These EACs can be purchased in an unbundled manner, independent of power purchase agreements. So you can simply buy the renewable energy credit or energy attribute credit separate from your power purchased from a utility or elsewhere, or they could be coupled with physical electricity purchases, depending on the contract structure. And under the current accounting scheme, it doesn't really differentiate between those two, as long as you have claim to the environmental attributes of the generation, which is what the energy attribute certificate certifies. Current corporate emissions accounting systems like the GHG protocol allow an EAC purchase to effectively reduce an institution's reported emissions from electricity consumption with 1 megawatt hour of electricity consumption, the emissions effectively zeroed out by the retirement of one EAC. There are a bunch of different ways, though, in theory, that we could design these different tracking mechanisms or attributional accounting systems to reflect the impact of voluntary procurement or different purchase decisions on the emissions that are resulting from corporate electricity consumption. The conventional method, as I mentioned, which is used by the US EPA and the GHG protocol and other guidances, allows participants to claim 1 megawatt hour of carbon-free electricity use for every qualifying energy attribute certificate from a carbon-free generator that they purchase and retire in a given year. So claiming 100% carbon-free electricity use in a given year means simply purchasing enough energy attribute certificates to match the total electricity consumption over the course of that period of time or year. So we describe this as volumetric annual matching or volumetric matching. The idea here being that I consume a total volume of energy regardless of when or where that's consumed. And as long as I have a claim to an equal quantity of energy attribute certificates, again, no matter where or when those were produced, from carbon, as long as they're produced by carbon-free generators, I can effectively cancel out each megawatt hour I consume with each EAC that I attach to that megawatt hour. There have been a number of claims and criticisms around volumetric matching, especially at least when it comes to these greenhouse gas accounting schemes. In particular, the coarse temporal accounting means that there can be very poor assessment of the ultimate emissions impacts. This particularly occurs as renewable energy penetration increases. Since wind and solar resources have low marginal costs, they tend to get dispatched first in the power system and displace the most expensive and often highest emitting marginal generators when they're producing. Because their output is correlated by the weather, the more wind and solar we deploy, the more it tends to concentrate in certain periods of time with less and less fossil generation, leading to lower than average marginal emissions rates at times when you have high amounts of generation from wind and solar. And those don't necessarily offset periods of time when you have high emissions on the grid with low amounts of wind and solar available. So this temporal mismatch can lead to a mismatch in the ultimate emissions impact of your purchases of power or your power consumption and the power generation that you're pointing to from the EAC purchases. In addition, as we're starting to see in many markets around the United States where wind and solar are simply economic or have been economic for some time due to current subsidies, such as Texas or Oklahoma or other places without significant procurement markets or compliance markets from state RPS policies. And going forward, projections estimate that due to the Inflation Reduction Act and other subsidies available, that significant amounts of clean energy deployment will occur simply due to economic incentives. That may lead to a lack of EAC scarcity, meaning that there's far more supply of energy attributes on the market than there is demand from current RPS policies, renewable portfolio standards, or clean electricity standards for policy compliance or voluntary market demand. And if that's the case, then an EAC supply is oversupplied, then purchases by corporate actors may not lead to any additional clean energy deployment, which would have very little emissions impact. In addition, these purchases can be unbundled and can be distinct in time and space from your actual consumption, which decouples energy attribute purchases from a consumer's physical electricity use and reliability needs on the grid. That can lead to potential basis risk and other financial risks because your power consumption is not tied to your offsetting production, as well as lack of contribution of these purchases to overall grid reliability needs. So a variety of concerns have been raised in recent years that are leading to a set of alternative proposals that help push the envelope further in the voluntary world and may lead to a rethinking of of greenhouse gas accounting standards as well. One alternative would be temporal matching. This is where participants purchase energy attributes not simply to match their overall volumetric consumption, but actually to match their consumption in the same hour in which the EAC is generated. So if you consume 100 megawatt hours in 1 hour, you need 100 megawatt hours worth of EACs to offset that or to match that consumption. And an energy attribute produced in a different hour cannot be used to substitute for an EAC in the current hour of consumption. That would mean that claiming 100% carbon-free electricity use in a given year means that you're purchasing enough energy attributes to match or exceed your electricity consumption in every hour of the year. So sometimes called 24/7 carbon-free electricity procurement by Google, one of its chief proponents, and others. The claimed advantages here are that the hourly requirement will increase EAC scarcity, so that even if we have an oversupply or abundance of energy attributes in certain periods of time, there will be other hours when we simply don't have enough clean electricity on the grid. And if you want to meet your hourly procurement requirements in those hours, you'll have to drive the deployment of additional clean energy that wouldn't otherwise have been deployed. It also may require the deployment of more advanced technologies that can create a more balanced and flexible portfolio of resources that can complement wind and solar, such as long-duration energy storage or clean, firm power generation technologies like nuclear, advanced geothermal, carbon capture, et cetera. Another proposal has come from other sectors or other actors to instead focus not on matching megawatt hours, but on matching emissions. So we call this approach the emissions matching approach. also known as emissionality or emissions first procurement. This approach tries to estimate the emissions impact of both production and consumption of electricity based on local hourly short-run marginal emissions rates. The short-run emissions rate is calculated as the change in grid emissions resulting from a small instantaneous change in electricity demand at that hour and location, assuming no change in generating capacity. So that's an important point we'll come back to later. These are short-run operational changes only for small marginal changes in consumption. But similar to how we price electricity through locational marginal prices, this would lead to short-run locational marginal emissions rates throughout the grid and throughout different hours of the day. And here the goal is to ensure that the sum of consumption times the short-run marginal emissions rates is offset by the sum of clean energy production times the short-run marginal emissions rates at the times and locations where that production occurs, an offsetting approach that could lead to net zero measured emissions impact over the course of the year. The claimed advantage is here. This accurately reflects our emissions impacts of procurements because we're directly measuring emissions here through the short-run marginal emissions rate. And it may encourage the most cost-effective abatement actions. For example, if it's cheaper to displace coal-fired power plants in far-off areas of the grid than it is to add additional renewable energy where the consumer is located, this may help you further the impact of each dollar spent on corporate procurement. So all of this raises questions for us and for others about what happens at the system level under different procurement rules. Each of these strategies has proposed a different definition of success, a different definition of what it means to be 100% carbon-free or net zero emissions, and they involve different metrics to incentivize procurement of different resources at different locations and times. And so you can see here as a simplified example of this, of three different strategies for this. A volumetric matching standard where the total production in green over the period is equal to the total consumption. An hourly matching standard, which would not deem this as 100% carbon-free because the hours when you have excess generation in the crosshatched above the consumption don't offset the hours when you have a deficit, the white parts of the bars there. And then an emissions accounting scheme where every hour you're counting the short-run marginal emissions rate denoted by the red line and calculating the offsetted emissions here again, not quite zero emissions under this calculation. So what we did in our work here is try to tackle this big question. If a company takes steps to achieve 100% carbon-free electricity defined under one of these different proposed matching standards, what's the actual consequential emissions impact on greenhouse gas emissions at the level of the entire electricity system? Here, we're hoping to count for both short-run operational decisions and changes on capacity entry and exit decisions. After all, these corporate procurement strategies are intended to drive new clean energy deployment. And so we need a modeling framework and a study framework that it can account for changes in capacity, both entry and exit or new capacity or retirement decisions, and how those impact operations and emissions across the whole sector. So I'll hand it over there to Wilson to explain more in detail what we did in our research and what we found so far.
Thanks, Jesse. Next slide. So the big question here, as Jesse said, is, oh, sorry, can we go back?
Went too far. There you
go. Thanks. The big question is really to figure out if a company takes steps to reach 100% carbon-free electricity use under a given matching strategy, what is the actual impact of those actions specifically on greenhouse gas emissions overall? So not just getting into what the claimed emissions of that company are, but how does this actually affect total greenhouse gas emissions entering the atmosphere, therefore climate change? And what's important is that, oh, Jesse, that's showing on our screen. Okay. The important thing to consider here is that that question cannot be answered through, empirically through real world evidence. We can't look back at a company signing a PPA with a solar plant, for example, and see how total emissions, entering the atmosphere from the electricity sector would be different had that company chosen not to sign that PPA. That requires knowledge of this counterfactual world that we simply don't have access to. And so our approach in this work is to use electricity system models, which are designed to model the behavior of electricity sector participants and the build out of the electricity sector over long time periods to effectively look at those counterfactuals and explore the impacts of the actions of individual actors on system level outcomes, including emissions. So we use a capacity expansion model here, which optimizes both the configuration and operations of the entire electricity system to meet electricity demand and various policy and physical constraints at least cost. And this effectively simulates what we would observe under either a fully competitive electricity market exposed to those same constraints and costs and incentives, or a centrally planned system where a central planner is trying to meet demand at minimal cost. And because this system or this model allows us to observe the build out of the electricity system and its operations and the impacts of various changes on those outcomes, we can compare counterfactual scenarios where a, say, voluntary buyer did or did not procure certain clean energy and compare system level outcomes in each to isolate the impact of that actor's actions on outcomes like emissions. Next slide, please. And so in this study, we use GenX, which is an open source electricity system capacity expansion model developed at Princeton and MIT. It's open source, so you can find all the model itself and all the inputs and results on the page where we posted our working paper, which I think we can get a link to after this. It has high temporal resolution, highly configurable. And what we use it for in this study is exploring the system level impacts of multiple voluntary carbon-free electricity procurement strategies for consumers in the Western United States. We use a 6-zone model of the Western interconnection representing major interzonal transmission constraints. We look at the build out of the electricity system from the present day through 2030, subject to the latest federal and state policies, under multiple scenarios for the technologies that are available for deployment. And we look at voluntary carbon-free electricity purchases made by commercial and industrial electricity users in either California or in the US Mountain West, i.e. Wyoming and Colorado. And we pick these systems because they have, they're fairly diverse in terms of their geography and their existing structure. California is very solar and gas heavy. Wyoming and Colorado are very coal and wind heavy. Next slide. And so in each of these cases that we model, we assume that a certain percent of C&I customers in a given target region, again, one of those two that I showed earlier, jointly pursue voluntary carbon-free electricity procurement under either volumetric matching, temporal matching, or emissions matching, the 3 strategies that Jesse described earlier. And this is done by modeling the procurement of carbon-free electricity sources that count towards meeting the goals of the particular voluntary consumers in question. These qualifying resources, we impose a couple restrictions on them. One is that they must be new build resources, so not deployed at the time of at the original model planning year, and that they must be located in the same model region as participating demand. Next slide. These requirements, the first, the new build requirement, essentially maximizes the chance that a given matching strategy actually reduces system level emissions. So basically giving all strategies the kind of optimal conditions to work under. And this is because, of course, if we allow procurement of existing resources, procuring power directly from those does not ever directly reduce emissions because it doesn't change the total amount of clean power coming out of those generators, unless those generators would have otherwise retired had they not been procured, which is the edge case that we don't include in our modeling here. Or unless there is enough total demand for EACs that existing resources cannot meet it. And that requires a very, very high level of demand because existing clean resources account for 40% of US electricity generation. So we we assume that the voluntary consumers are targeting new build resources to have the maximum possible impact on system level emissions. We also require that the contracted resources come from within the same region as participating demand. This is mostly a simplifying assumption, which kind of takes the question of transmission bottlenecks out of the experiment. I'll note that some of the strategies, for example, emissions matching, in particular, advertises the advantages of procuring from different zones. And this is something that we do not include in this study. We're mainly focusing on being able to compare the matching strategies under conditions that all should, that should be compatible with each. I'll note that even though the model assumes that within these larger regions, we have no in-region congestion, and we consider only the major interregional barriers, that is no oversimplification of reality. So there will be some transmission congestion even in these fairly well-connected regions. Next slide. And so when we focus on measuring impact, we focus almost exclusively on system level outcomes, which is, of course, what actually affects climate change. We don't care about what emissions impacts the various participants claim to have or how we allocate emissions among participants. What we care about in this study is how much do total CO2 emissions from the entire Western interconnection change as a result of voluntary procurement of clean power. And so, again, we use counterfactual scenarios to isolate these impacts, essentially looking at the total emissions from a system where voluntary procurement does not take place, and then comparing those to the total emissions from a counterfactual scenario, again, the deployment of and operation of resources across the coming decade, in a scenario where voluntary procurers do make clean energy purchases under a given matching strategy. And this is how we create this metric of consequential emissions impact. Next slide. Now, starting into our results, the first thing I want to cover is just what are voluntary participants actually encouraged to procure under each of these matching strategies. And so this is focusing on capacity outcomes. These plots show changes in generating capacity of a scenario where voluntary procurement does take place compared to a reference case where there's no voluntary procurement. And I'll first focus on the crosshatch bars, which show the technologies, the generation technologies that are actually procured by the participating C&I consumers. We have different matching strategies here. So we've got 100% volumetric matching, 100% emissions matching, and then 3 levels of temporal matching, 90%, 98%, and 100%. And then within each of those scenarios, we have 3 technology availability scenarios. So the far left bar assumes only existing technologies or established technologies are available. Those are wind, solar, geothermal, and lithium-ion batteries. The middle bar additionally assumes the availability of long-duration storage technologies, including metal air storage and hydrogen storage. And the rightmost bar additionally assumes that we have available natural gas with nearly 100% carbon capture and combustion of zero carbon fuels in combined cycle plants. And so looking at the capacity procurements made under each of these strategies, what's immediately clear is that both volumetric matching and emissions matching incentivize procurement of essentially the cheapest available renewable energy resource in a region. So in California, in the left plot, that's going to be solar power. And in Wyoming and Colorado on the right, it's going to be wind. By contrast, temporal matching, because you have to meet your demand in all hours of the year, incentivizes the procurement of a more diverse mix. You can see here that for 10% C&I participation in California, you get some geothermal, some wind, some batteries, and some advanced techs that they're available. And in Wyoming and Colorado, you get a similar mix of a range of technologies. Next slide. Now, this slide focuses on changes in the energy mix as a result of the actions of a participating consumer. And what's key here is that when we look at the changes in total generation, comparing again the scenario where voluntary procurements did take place, the scenario where they did not, what you can see is that although voluntary procurements led to an increase in solar and geothermal generation in these California cases under volumetric and emissions matching, these were offset by a nearly identical displacement of wind and solar power and geothermal power by other developers. So, plants that were not procured by participating consumers. And in the volumetric and emissions matching cases in Wyoming and Colorado, we see a very similar phenomenon, but with wind and some amounts of solar power. On the other hand, the procurements made under temporal matching do still displace a certain amount of wind and solar from essentially third parties, but they also displace a fairly significant amount of fossil generation, being either from gas plants or coal plants, which you can see is those the reductions in the black and brown on those bars. Next slide.
Well, so do you want to explain the removed C&I load benchmark?
Yeah, sure. So this benchmark on the left essentially shows the change in emissions the change in generation from various technologies. If instead of making any voluntary procurements, the participating consumers simply stopped consuming electricity. So this is essentially asking the question, what are the resources that would go towards meeting your or essentially are going towards meeting your electricity and would not be used if you were not choosing to consume electricity in the in the way that you are. And so we consider this a kind of benchmark to, not identical, but a decent benchmark to what should the impact be of essentially zeroing out your electricity consumption. The resources that stop generating as a result of you not consuming electricity should be ideally roughly equivalent to the ones that are displaced if you meet your electricity demand with 100% clean resources that you have procured. And we see some similarity between that outcome and the outcomes under 100% temporal matching, though again, it's not identical. Next slide. So to explain these outcomes in kind of a qualitative sense, what's happening, and you can see here, this is the plot on the right shows essentially the generation at each average hour, or the change in generation for various technologies at each average hour over an average day of the year in California under each of these three strategies. Under volumetric matching, you see that, again, the buyers have procured a significant amount of solar power, but these solar procurements directly compete with and displace other commercial renewable energy resources. And so you can see that although there's a significant increase in solar power that is attached to the voluntary participants, there's a equal and in fact identical decrease in solar power being generated by third-party market participants.
Another way to think about that is that there's a certain amount of solar that would have been built anyway that these voluntary procurements are laying claim to. So in our model, we have two copies of each resource. You can either allow it to be built for the normal market or be built for procurement. In reality, it could just be the same site, and instead of selling it to the normal, to some other user, that site is being sold to the voluntary buyer. But it would have been built in either case. It's another way to think about the counterfactual.
Yeah, these are two ways of thinking about the same outcome.
Yep.
Right here, which is essentially no change in total solar generation from the base case. Under emissions matching, what's interesting is that the buyer is actually assuming, and you can see this red line here, this is the measured short-run marginal emissions rate from our model. The buyer assumes that because this marginal emissions rate is non-zero, even during the day when it is lower than at night, that it's offsetting fossil generation by procuring solar power that generates during these hours. But in fact, the outcome is almost identical to the case with volumetric matching, where these solar procurements don't displace the short-run marginal resources. They displace competing solar projects that would have otherwise been built, like Jesse was referring to. And under temporal matching, the key difference that we see here is that even though we still have some of that displacement occurring, particularly during the day when other, again, there are other merchant, or not necessarily merchant, but just other renewable energy providers in the market. The fact that temporal matching requires clean generation, even say at night, when fossil generation would normally be economically preferable, means that it's fossil generation that ends up being displaced by that additional clean power rather than other clean resources. Next slide. And so translating all this into emissions impact, one of the key results of this work is we found that under volumetric and emissions matching in most of these scenarios, we end up seeing effectively zero impact on system level emissions as a result of 100% either volumetric matching or emissions matching. So even though these accounting systems would claim that the emissions impact of an electricity consumer taking these actions is zero, or is their emissions impact zero, and they've effectively completely reduced their emissions, the actual impact on system level emissions is nothing. There are small reductions in California when we get to 25% participation and above, because there's a limit on the amount of in-state generation that that is deployed under the reference case. On the other hand, we see that there are increasing reductions and real reductions in system level emissions for increasing levels of temporal matching, which typically, though not always, exceed this benchmark rate, which represents, going back to what Jesse talked about earlier, the change in system level emissions if the participant were simply to stop consuming electricity. And so we can see that in California, it breaks the benchmark when you get to 100%. In Wyoming and Colorado, it breaks it in one scenario and falls below it in others. But in all cases, it leads to a significant reduction in system level emissions. Next slide. But this comes at a cost. And of course, in the volumetric and emissions matching cases, there is no emissions impact and there's also no cost impact. It costs no more to procure the resources necessary to meet these matching targets than it would to simply consume grid power or buy the cost optimal PPA without any concern for emissions. And that's because the resources that are procured under these are ones that would have been economic anyway. Whereas under temporal matching, you have to deploy resources that would not normally be economic. And so there is a significant cost premium associated with this, which can reach up to exceeding $20 per megawatt hour in California. It's a lot cheaper in Wyoming and Colorado because there's high quality wind power there, which leads to easier round the clock matching. Next slide. And then when we look at this in terms of the effective abatement cost, so this is essentially the cost to the participant per change in CO2 emissions at the system level. This is roughly $60 to $70 a ton in California, and less than $25 a ton in Wyoming and Colorado under temporal matching. Again, there's no emissions abatement under the other strategies here. And so kind of one major conclusion of this work is that the failure to drive emissions reductions from some strategies is really traceable to a lack of additionality. They are deploying new clean power, but they are not deploying new clean power that would not have otherwise been deployed. And this is in large part because the improvement in cost that we've seen from clean resources, the subsidies under the recently passed Inflation Reduction Act, significantly increases the supply of EACs without doing much to increase demand for EACs. And so what we see is basically that the demand for EACs is made up of state clean energy standards, which do not exist everywhere, voluntary demand, and that this does not add up. Essentially, this total supply that is economic, that makes sense to build, just purely due to the money you'll make from selling that electricity, is greater than the demand for EACs, which means that conversely, increasing EAC demand does not have an effect on supply, does not lead to additional clean power being generated. And so to explore the impact of a different kind of policy environment where there is a binding demand for EACs, we looked at some cases where there was a hypothetical 80% clean electricity standard, say, implemented by the federal government, which makes EAC demand rather than simply market economics the primary driver of supply.
You could also think of that as a scenario where voluntary procurement and state policies all react to the cheap supply of EACs by increasing their ambition to collectively procure the same amount of, with the equivalent of 80% clean electricity across the WEC. So in either case, it's enough to bring the market for EACs back to a binding supply requirement.
And in this scenario, what we do observe is that the emissions impact of every procurement strategy is non-zero. And in fact, the optimal portfolios that are procured are actually near identical, but they now drive an emissions impact in the case of volumetric and emissions matching, whereas previously they did not. I'll note that reductions are still significantly greater in the temporal matching scenarios due to both the alignment of clean electricity generation with consumption and the fact that a optimal temporal matched portfolio often involves generating more electricity than you use because you slightly oversize wind and solar power usually. But in all cases, temporal matching does exceed this benchmark rate. And that happens in some cases for emissions matching, but not in others, depending on where the load is located, or emissions matching and volumetric matching. Next slide. But what's interesting is that in terms of effective abatement cost, the effective abatement cost of temporal matching actually has not changed much compared to the scenarios without this 80% CES. But the effective abatement cost, if you look at them just in terms of that metric, actually volumetric matching is the most cost effective, which makes sense because you're effectively, it incentivizes deployment of the next cheapest megawatt hour of clean power, which leads to inherently the least cost outcomes. But again, the absolute emissions reduction is not as high, and there isn't a incentive for deployment of advanced technologies. Next slide.
All right. I'll pick things back up. So if we take a step back from the quantitative results, we think about what this says for each of these procurement strategies. What we can take away, I think, for volumetric matching, which has been the strategy to date to drive additional renewable energy deployment and really has played a truly catalytic role in driving clean energy or renewable energy on the grid historically, is that if we're moving forward into an environment where EAC demand exceeds supply across much or all of the country, or in locations today where that's already true, like much of the central part of the country where we lack significant RPS policies, and yet have a significant amount of wind or solar deployment, think Iowa or Kansas or Texas or other areas in the wind belt, where already EAC demand significantly exceeds supply, we should not expect this strategy to lead to any additional clean generation in the long-term context where you consider the entry and exit dynamics that we're thinking about here. So this will only, this strategy will only drive additional deployment and emissions reductions in cases where you have a binding or tight market for EAC demand that leads to significantly non-zero prices for those energy attributes. Again, that was true largely in the past in many parts of the country, particularly when state RPS policies are binding and fairly expensive to meet, but unlikely to be true going forward as the economic incentives established by the Inflation Reduction Act over the long term here and the reduction in costs that we've been seeing for wind and solar mean that substantial amounts of wind and solar deployment each year are economic without these binding state policies. And even if generation is additional, it is not enough to satisfy the requirement that you reduce your emissions to zero. In other words, volumetric matching will reduce system level emissions, but is not guaranteed to eliminate a consumer's emissions impact due to the temporal and spatial mismatch you may have between the power that's being procured and its impact on long run system level emissions and the consumption of your own electricity. In other words, megawatt hours are not necessarily equal to tons at the system level. Marginal emissions accounting promises to try to get around that limitation by actually measuring the tons, right? So we're shifting now from focus on megawatt hours and volume of electricity use or production to an estimated impact on emissions. Now, the challenge here is that the observable outcome that we can use to base these procurement strategies is the short-run marginal emissions rate. To illustrate why this is a key flawed metric to estimate the long run or consequential system impact, let's think about what the emissions impact is of adding an electric vehicle to the grid. Now, if we only account for the short run marginal emissions rate in much of the country today, because renewables have zero marginal cost and come into the lower part of the dispatch curve or supply curve, we still have gas or coal on the margin in much of the hours of the year. So if we consider only a small short run change in operational behavior across most hours in most parts of the country, that will involve emissions from, or an additional megawatt hour of generation and associated emissions from a fossil generator on the short run margin. That's why many studies that estimate the emissions impact of EV adoption, looking at short run marginal emissions rates, show relatively modest, although still real, reductions in emissions relative to internal combustion vehicles. However, if you consider the fact that a large number of EVs added to the grid is driving a significant increase in demand, that's in turn going to drive the behavior of new supply, meaning developers of renewable energy projects are going to attempt to anticipate changes in demand and add supply in time to meet that demand, and we consider the impact on the long run margin, we have to account for changes in capacity. There we could say that, demand in the middle of the day is going to be most cost effectively met by new solar resources, or overnight by wind in certain parts of the country. And the mix of new resources that are likely to be built to meet a given profile of new demand from EVs is very different than the short run marginal emissions or generators that you would see from a short run marginal emissions rate. In fact, as previous work has shown, the short run marginal emissions rate is not an accurate predictor at all of the actual long run marginal emissions rate or the consequential impacts that incorporates these changes in capacity decisions that are also going to result from different patterns of demand or procurement. This is work from NREL that looked at the actual long run marginal emissions rates using a capacity planning framework similar to what we did in our study, and compared that to short run marginal emissions rates and found that it consistently overestimates and inaccurately estimates the impacts of production and consumption. What we would love to do, in fact, is to use long run marginal emissions rates. That's what we're trying to affect, right? We want to have the lowest long run emissions impact accounting for changes in generation and capacity. The unfortunate point being that these long-run marginal emissions rates are unobservable fundamentally in the real world, right? We can calculate them with a model when we can do a clean counterfactual scenario, but there's no way to really know what the long-run marginal emissions impact is of a given decision today. We could roughly project them or estimate them with electricity system models, but as a modeler myself, I don't know that I would want to base large-scale procurement decisions or a whole greenhouse gas accounting system based on some estimates from different capacity planning models. So instead, what we're left with is a sort of fundamental epistemic limitation, which is that we're trying to optimize for something that we can't observe. And unfortunately, the measure that we can observe, short-run marginal emissions, is simply not predictive of the outcomes that we truly care about. That leaves us then with temporal matching, which is an imperfect substitute for the long-run marginal emissions rate, may in fact be more expensive than some hypothetical scenario in which you did know exactly the most cost-effective way to reduce long-run marginal emissions. But what it does have is the advantage of being knowable. We know our own patterns of electricity consumption, we know the patterns of production, and effectively what we're trying to emulate with temporal matching is an outcome that's roughly equivalent to eliminating a consumer's electricity demand from the grid entirely. Like taking your load and directly plugging it into a clean supply. If you are consuming 100% carbon-free electricity that's deliverable to your location at every hour of the day, it's roughly equivalent to being an off-grid resource, to being supplied entirely off-grid by clean resources or being removed from the grid entirely. And so this is a proxy for the kind of long-run marginal emissions impact that we want. And as we've shown in our modeling, generally leads to the same kind of impact as reducing the load from the grid entirely. Although due to the asymmetry of adding new supply versus removing demand in a complicated system, it can't be guaranteed to be exactly the same. So what we have here is a rough but workable proxy for the kinds of impacts that we want to have at the consequential level through voluntary procurement decisions. All right, we'll leave it there. I'd love to get your questions. This is quite a complicated topic and one that is increasingly relevant for both policymaking and corporate strategy. And we hope we've added something to the conversation today with this work.
Thank you so much, Jesse and Wilson. That was wonderful. You've got a very engaged audience here. There's a lot of questions. Again, folks who have questions, go to slido.com, enter in ESIG12, and ask your questions. The first question is about long-run emissions matching approaches, and I think you had addressed that, and probably this question was asked before you got to that part in your talk, but was there anything that you wanted to add about your approach using long-run marginal emissions versus not? I know you've already.
Yeah, I mean, I think just it's important to note all the caveats that go along with any kind of long-term modeling here, right? We're making, projections about the long-run future under uncertainty, and I think the best use of these capacity planning tools are not for prediction, but rather for exploration. That's how they should be used in integrated resource planning, for example, is to explore a range of scenarios and try to use that to inform an overall, risk-averse strategy that meets your future needs. But if we were trying to use them to predict the long-run marginal emissions rates and then drive procurement strategies based on those, we'd have to have a lot of confidence in the accuracy of those approaches. Now, I should say maybe maybe we can get better at our modeling and get good enough that it's a reasonable proxy to think about, and I'm interested in exploring that more. But we should be modest and humble about our abilities to predict the future accurately with these kinds of tools.
Sure, great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And to jump in, I think it's definitely possible that we can identify, directionally correct actions via modeling of long-run marginal emissions impacts. I think it gets really tough to get down to the hour-by-hour quantitative, assessment of, corporate emissions rates and things like that, relying entirely on modeling like this. It's, making assumptions over decades.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. So for everyone, yes, presentation slides and recording will be shared. You'll get an email soon with all that information.
Yeah, and we'll include in that the link to the working paper that includes all this in detail, and happy for your review on that too.
That would be great. Someone asks, in the counterfactual, how do all these projects get financed and built without a purchase commitment?
Yeah, this is a great question, and one that is important to note that when we're doing this kind of modeling, there is no explicit representation of power purchase agreements or project finance or all the sort of reality of what goes into financing a project. What we have are weighted average cost of capital that are reflected in the model, and typically assume some kind of project structure or financing structure that would hedge the revenues for these projects. The basic assertion is that if there's money to be made on these projects, or there's money to be saved by purchasing from these projects, someone is out there willing to enter a long-term contract. And so again, that may be a voluntary actor. They may be the ones who do that, but if they don't, somebody else has an economic incentive to do that as well. And it's difficult to then say that there's any kind of consequential impact from a corporate PPA in that context, right? It's likely to be important. They do need some off-taker probably with some long-term contract or financial hedging in order to finance a project at a reasonable cost of capital. But if the project is very competitive economically and the price that they're offering on the market is lower than alternatives, someone should want to buy that power, is the effective kind of implicit assumption in the model. But of course, we recognize that is a simplification of what goes on in reality. And it's important to note that there still is an important role for voluntary procurement in stepping up to the plate and giving that long-term contract structure that projects need. I just think it raises really important questions when you get into the realm of attributional emissions accounting or consequential claims about the impact of those procurements on actual system level outcomes.
Excellent, thanks. Someone asks, how would the results for California change if you extended the analysis through 2045 when California requires 100% zero electric vehicle sales? Or zero carbon electricity.
Zero carbon electricity. Yeah, I mean, at the point where all supply has to be carbon free, then there's not a whole lot of consequential impact on emissions of any decisions here. But again, there's an important role for the contracting. But yeah, I mean, that point, job well done, right? We've gotten the transition to the system that we're looking for, and there's not going to be much additional impact from any kind of voluntary action.
So I'll note that if only California, or if if there's a significant portion of you know, electricity outside of California that's still being generated by fossil resources, California, I believe as it's currently structured, their CES allows for imports of, you know, resources outside of California, and it accounts for sales on an annual volumetric basis. And so there could still be scenarios where, you know, even though 100% of electricity being sold is matched with, you know, EACs to California consumers, that there isn't a non-zero emissions impact from the actions of.
Yeah, thanks, Wilson. I'm being too charitable to California. The CES is not actually 100% of generation. It's 100% of retail sales on an annual basis. At least that's how the CPUC is interpreting the statute at this point, as I understand it. And that means that losses from transmission, storage, cycling, et cetera, are not included in transmission and distribution, are not included in the total. And generation is larger than the required volume of supply that has to be clean. So you do have room to hide gas plants in that mix, even in the current statute.
All right, good point. Someone asks, Emissions First seeks to procure renewables in the most carbon intensive grid, not necessarily constrained to the US. How is this evaluated?
So that's the emissions matching approach that we're looking at here. We didn't allow for geographic dispersion, but what we're basically showing here is that the proposal to use short-run marginal emissions rates as the measure of consequential impact of those procurement decisions is fundamentally inaccurate. It is not an accurate proxy for the long-run or consequential emissions impacts. Now, that's a case where, again, if you're just trying to directionally drive good outcomes, you could use estimates of long-run marginal emissions rates by modeling different grids around the world and try to direct procurement to those grids that have the, you know, the highest long-run marginal emissions rate that you could displace. Or to procurement strategies, I should say, in places that have the highest displaced long-run marginal emissions. But again, I would be reluctant to use those in some kind of corporate accounting scheme, right? So you could sort of say, yes, directionally, this is a dirty part of the world that we're having a positive impact in. That's a valid claim. But saying that the emissions displaced by that is exactly equal to my scope 2 emissions from operations and consumption of electricity in a certain part of the world, and therefore I've reached net zero, would be a pretty challenging claim to justify, I think. So that's, at this point, that's sort of where I stand on the emissions first approach. I think, again, it could have directionally positive effects, but it's very difficult to use the proposed short-run marginal emissions rates as a valid proxy for the outcomes that we really care about.
Mm-hmm.
To jump in on that too, I'll note that it is a real thing that certain grids do have higher emissions abatement potential than others. I mean, when we look at temporal matching in California versus Wyoming and Colorado, the emissions reductions are higher in Wyoming and Colorado because the resource being offset is nearly entirely coal. So that's a real thing. It's a question of, you know, how that can be, like Jesse said, incorporated into something that's quantitative.
All right, thanks, Wilson. Adam D. from EPRI asks, has Zero Lab compared system impacts by comparing these clean energy procurement approaches to an optimal capacity expansion to achieve GHG emission targets?
Yeah, actually, we were just talking about that today. It's hard to do that for the, we didn't do that in this case. We used the sort of benchmark of removing the load. We could have actually set, I guess, the emissions level that corresponds to removing the load and set that as emissions cap, and then identified the lowest cost way to meet the same emissions outcomes. Maybe we need to do that before as well. But yeah, we were just talking about today. That would be a valid benchmark to kind of come up with a hypothetical best practice if you had perfect foresight and perfect control over the system to find the lowest cost way to deliver the same amount of emissions reduction. And that could be a good benchmark to compare the relative efficacy or performance of these strategies. You could do the same thing for new loads, right? So here we're talking about procurements that match existing C&I demand that's in the load profile in either case. It's just either buying clean or not. As some folks probably know, we've also done similar modeling for hydrogen electrolysis procurement under different strategies where you have a new load that's added to the grid, and that would also probably be a good proxy for those new loads, is set the emissions limit to be equal to the emissions without that load, add the load to the system, and then see what the most cost-effective way to cut emissions would be. That's something I think we're excited to try soon. So good intuition, Adam.
Yeah, that would be really interesting to see. Wilson, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, just that, that's a useful benchmark, and I agree that we should definitely try to do that, and we will. I think the key, one key thing to distinguish is that in those scenarios, that's the system, optimizing the behavior of every system participant based on what's effectively a carbon price. And so even if we can identify the optimal changes in generation to achieve a certain emissions impact, that won't necessarily be something that an individual consumer can replicate through their
Yeah, I mean, it
actions.
definitely won't be. Yeah, it definitely won't be something that you could replicate. Yeah. So it's only useful as a hypothetical kind of comparison point to be like, well, what if you had perfect control and the lowest cost strategy? It would be interesting to know, though, for example, that hourly procurement costs more, right? Because it has a bigger impact and drives additional deployment. How much more does it cost, though, than the least cost strategy? Is it, it costs $20 and it would have been 18 if you could perfectly optimize everything, or is it twice as expensive? I don't know the answer to that yet, and we'd like to find out.
Great. So we're at the top of the hour, so we need to wrap this up. I want to thank Jesse and Wilson for a really informative presentation. As I mentioned earlier, an email is going to go out to everyone once the video file gets posted. We're going to answer the questions we didn't get those posted. We really appreciate everyone's engagement. Look forward to seeing you again soon. We have a webinar on September 20th by Julia Matavosian on grid forming interconnection requirements. The fall workshop starts October 23rd. You can find all this information at www.esig.energy, including everything from this webinar will be posted up there too, as soon as we can. Jesse, Wilson, thank you once again. Really informative, very timely webinar. Thanks to all the participants for your interest, and we look forward to seeing you again in the near future. So
thank you all.
Thanks.